Welcome back, my fellow assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. Last week we mentioned how there were a few big oofs in the tech world that we talked about, and this week was a little more of the same. One of them, it's just straight up deja vu. But yeah, another rough week for some of the world's biggest tech companies, from being forced to pay millions of dollars, or I guess more specifically, hundreds of millions of dollars in lawsuits, to massive layoffs and kind of the complete embrace of what people call dystopia. And like I mentioned before already, the whole deja vu going on. There's been some moves. But as negative and downer as that might seem, we do at least end this episode on a little bit of a positive note, talking about some of the benefits of having a very stable production environment. So that is coming up this week. But before we get into all of that, let's start off with our trivia question for the week. So this week's trivia question is: Unity is a commonly used cross-platform game engine and was initially released in 2005 at a developer conference. What was the name of the conference that the Unity game engine was originally released in 2005? And that is your trivia question for the week. Now, before we get into our cybersecurity tip, which will sound very familiar to last week, we have to give a quick round of applause for Google, because there was a class action lawsuit that was filed in 2019 against Google, and it has finally reached its conclusion. So, as a result of this class action lawsuit, Google has been ordered to pay $314 million for charges that it misused Android device user cellular data when they were idle to passively send information to themselves, in this case to Google. So way to go, Google. Good job. Way to continue your track record of respecting user privacy and all that good stuff. So in case any of you were skeptical and thought I was a tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy theorist for all of the accusations and comments I've made about Google over the past few years, and their whole business model of harvesting user data, well, here's a prime example of them basically doing just that, because if they didn't do it, then they wouldn't have had to pay the money. Again, I'm not a lawyer, so I guess you could maybe try to argue that they didn't actually, whatever, they have to pay because this was alleged. Anyway, those arguing against Google had this to say on the matter, I guess like during the trial or whatever. So they said, quote, "Although Google could make it so that these transfers happened only when the phones were connected to Wi-Fi, Google instead designed these transfers so they can take place over a cellular network." End quote. So basically, rather than doing it over Wi-Fi, I guess Google made the decision to do it over a cellular network. And probably one of the sickest things about this is the fact of how personally identifiable doing something over a cellular network is versus just like a standard Wi-Fi connection. Because if you're doing it over just a standard like Wi-Fi connection, you could potentially be using some kind of VPN tunnel to kind of like mask your traffic to make it look like you're coming from somewhere else. But if you're using a cellular network, you can be basically pinpointed down to your exact location. Not to mention the fact that your cellular plan identifies exactly who you are. And So theoretically, if Google wanted to, they could probably have a personal identifier for each one of the cellular devices that's connecting to them and potentially build a profile on them that way. Not saying they did that because I obviously don't work for Google and can see the information for myself. But given the fact of some of Google's past track records, it would not surprise me in the slightest if that was something that they were doing. So yeah, so obviously, the little piggy, which is Google in this case, was not very happy that one of their sources of user data was cut off from them. So shockingly, they decided to appeal the case, which to their credit, if you're a big corporation like this and you lose a lawsuit like that, I mean, I think it's kind of a no-brainer that you're gonna try to appeal it because, I mean, if you can save yourself $314 million, I mean, why wouldn't you? Um, but in regard to the data that was being transferred to Google, Google claims the data that was being transferred was only related to, quote, services that are critical to the security, performance, and reliability of Android devices. Um, Now, those arguing against Google made the claim that, well, they made it sound like it was a lot more than just that. But they were kind of vague in the fact that they said a variety of information, which technically, I guess you could argue just a variety of information. A variety of information could just include information that's related to critical security, performance, and reliability concerns and whatnot. So I guess you potentially could make that argument. Um, but in order to improve the performance of any kind of app or operating system, you need to know how people use the app or operating system in order to identify places to optimize. Because sure, you can do code audits and stuff and find more optimized ways to do things. But one way to kind of target your optimizations is identify how people are using the app, what kind of functions they're doing, and then kind of go from there. So, for instance, if you see that most users are, say, trying to search for, I don't know, words that start with A, say 30% of the time, and every other letter is significantly less than that for whatever reason, I don't know. You could kind of take that into account in developing your app and kind of adjust your searching algorithm to kind of prioritize A's and maybe have some kind of queuing mechanism to potentially, or not necessarily queuing mechanism, but caching mechanism to kind of keep those more commonly searched items in cache, so it's a lot quicker to return those to the user, so basically improving the speed performance of getting results. But in order to understand that, like I said, you kind of have to know how people are using your app. Now, when it comes to tracking user analytics in this case, there's a few different ways that you can do it. You can do like the bare minimum. It can be as innocuous as you just log, say you're working on an app that has to read data from like a file system. One thing you could potentially do is it could be as innocuous as it took X number of milliseconds to load this file from the disk into memory. Cool. But you could also make it a lot more, I guess, liberal in your application and collect a little bit more data and still make the argument that it is for the sake of performance. So, for instance, if you tracked the user that accessed the file, the time in which they accessed the file, how long they had the file open for, in addition to how many milliseconds it took. Technically, that's all related to performance, you could make the argument for, even though you're also collecting a lot more data about this singular interaction compared to just logging how long it took to open the file. Now, you could make the argument, I guess, that how long you have a file open for could be valuable to the performance or optimization because it could help you determine how long you should kind of keep things in cache or in memory versus when you should swap things out, things like that. So you theoretically could make the argument, but again, I think if you think that it sounds like I'm stretching here, that's because I am. um, i- Personally, I am unsurprisingly very much of the mindset of principle of least privilege, both in terms of what you should have access to as a user and what you should have access to in regards to your users' information. So if you don't need something if you don't need something to make your app function, then you shouldn't get it. So for instance, if your app is just a fun game, you shouldn't need to collect your user's name, credit card number, email address, things like that, right? You obviously don't need to do that. Now, if you have things like in-app purchases, I guess that's a little bit different. But if it's a standard like generic app that it's literally just plug and play, you just open it up, do the thing, and you're done. You don't need to be collecting that very personal information. Yeah, like I said, if you want to collect things for performance metrics, it should be only things specifically related to that metric. So, for instance, we kind of already touched on one like opening files. But if you wanted to say you wanted to improve the performance of like your searching or whatever, you could log, how long individual searches take. For maybe you log the item or name or whatever that was searched for and how long the search took. You don't need to log any additional information as to who made the search or what their previous search history was. This is basically, you don't need to add a unique identifier to the data to make it for performance, right? You obviously don't need that. Now, if you did want to kind of make that kind of optimization for performance improvements, and you did want to kind of improve the optimization of your search, then yes, you would need to be collecting information such as what are your users searching for and how long did those searches take. But again, if you don't attach any sort of unique identifier to it and you figure out a way in your logging mechanism to make it completely anonymous, that would, in my opinion, be the preferred route to it, since then you don't necessarily have to worry about users not trusting you with them searching whatever they happen to be searching for in your application. So yeah, that is, uh, I guess, the latest in this case. So uh, I'm not, losing any sleep over this. The fact that Google has to pay out $314 million doesn't make me sweat at all. But with that, let's get into this week's cybersecurity tip. So no, this upcoming cybersecurity tip is not deja vu, and I did not intentionally basically pick the same thing, and this is not the same story as last week. But Cisco has once again had a perfect 10 CVE that you need to patch. Honestly, when I was looking at potential like news stories and things to talk about for this episode, I saw that and I had to do a double take because I was like, wait a second, did the page not refresh from the last time I came here like a week ago? Because basically this exact same story was there. Cisco has, a 10 CVE for, remote code execution. I was like, we already talked about that. This has to be old. And then I checked the date and I was like, nope, this literally just happened again. So here we are, talking about Cisco and their 10 out of 10 CVEs that apparently they really like for some reason. But I guess we have to first ask, okay, how did this vulnerability happen? Surely it couldn't have been something as simple as hard coding credentials into the code base, right? Wrong. So Cisco said, quote, this vulnerability is due to the presence of static user credentials for the root account that are reserved for use during development. Oh my goodness, guys. Cisco, come on. What are you doing? I mean, this is like beyond rookie mistake material, right? Like, you do not program the root credentials into the operating system like that. Oh my gosh, come on, Cisco. Like, okay, don't get me wrong. I have absolutely done this before where I have coded credentials of some kind into the code base for testing purposes because it's quite annoying if you have to manually type credentials in or, what have you, or pass them in as an argument or something. It just makes your life a lot easier to kind of hard code them in there. With that said, if you're well, I guess maybe not most, but if you're using a kind of a lower level language for an operating system type thing like Cisco, say you're using something like C or C++, there's this concept of an if-def, which basically tells the compiler, hey, if X flag exists, include this code, or if it doesn't, don't include this code. So if you really, really, really wanted to hard code your credentials into your software, you could do some sort of if-def check at compile time to basically check to see, is this a development build or is this a release build? If it's a release build, obviously don't include the credentials hard coded in there. If it's a development build, okay, maybe you can include them in there because it should never see the light of day. Um, but even still, just don't hard code credentials in your code in the first place, since then this never even becomes an issue. Because, like I said, not every language supports compile time checks like that. In the case of if-def, so sometimes if something's in the code base, it's in there and it can be accessed if you know how to get there, which obviously is not the case if you do an if-def because that's literally a compile time thing. So the compiler will literally ignore code in if-defs that don't meet certain requirements. So that code will literally not be in your executable at all, or your binary or your operating system or whatever the case is. So Cisco went on to say about how this attack is exploited, quote, an attacker could exploit this vulnerability by using the account to log into an affected system. A successful exploit could allow the attacker to log into the affected system and execute arbitrary commands as root. Ah, yes. Remote code execution as root, as bad as it gets. That's why this, yet again, scores a perfect 10 out of 10. Now, I get the fact that humans make mistakes. Granted, like I said, I have hard coded credentials in code bases before, specifically when I was testing, but then I would obviously make sure I removed them prior to actually deploying it or anything like that. Um, but it goes beyond the human factor because Cisco is a very big company. And a serious question that I have is, how in the world did hard coded credentials pass code review? Because if you're a big company like Cisco, don't tell me that a random developer can just arbitrarily write some code, commit it to their local Git repository, do a push, and have that code reach production somehow. That should not happen if you are a big company like Cisco. There should be checks in place to basically make sure that any code that goes into the main line of the repository is checked and verified. Otherwise, some sort of check along the build process and whatever CI/CD pipeline you have set up would cause it to fail. So somehow this had to have gone through a code review process. And unless the developers were completely clueless and not paying attention during this code review, they should have clearly seen that there are hard coded credentials within this committed change. So, how did that not get caught? So, somehow, I mean, The other thing of it too is there are these things called static analysis tools that can analyze your code for vulnerabilities like hard coded credentials, and you can put that in your CI/CD pipeline to basically ensure that if hard coded credentials are in there, they will get it basically will completely block your deployment and prevent it from going any further. So I guess unless there's like maybe some override in Cisco's system, if there's like maybe an urgent patch that needs to go out, and you're like, we don't care if there's any issues, like this needs to go out, and you can like override approvals and things like that. So unless maybe an engineer was like, nah, LGTM looks good to me, full send, and just kind of send it on through, I really am struggling to identify how in the world in 2025 a hard coded credentials for the root account, no less, could have made it through a code review process at such a large company like Cisco with so many eyes on the code that goes into their uh, various code packages, operating systems, whatever the case is. I'm really struggling to understand how something like that could happen at Cisco. So if you have any ideas how this potentially could have slipped through the cracks at Cisco, please let me know, because like I said, I'm honestly having trouble here. So if you're on YouTube, leave a comment with your theory, or you can email me at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. Link is down in the show notes. So please, if you have any ideas, do reach out. But we're getting to the point now where I'm kind of happy that I don't have any Cisco gear in my home lab, because this would kind of be annoying to patch, which I guess on the one hand, the Cisco gear that I would have, if I would have some, would probably pass like their update life cycle anyway, so it's not like they would be getting any patches regardless. Um but still, with how many issues they've been having over the years, I mean, you never know, right? If you happen to pick up like a used Cisco switch or router or whatever, say, 5-10 years down the road, that maybe had one of these issues, you really kind of have to make sure you do your due diligence to make sure that the Cisco switch or router, whatever's firmware, is up to date and the latest, and make sure if it's not, you flash it. Because there have been, like we've mentioned, literally the past 2 weeks, there have been 3 CVEs with perfect tens on Cisco devices. So you really kind of have to be careful here. So yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm kind of happy that I don't have Cisco. Maybe I won't ever get Cisco. I don't know. We'll see. But with the past couple weeks, it has made me quite glad that I do not have any Cisco devices in my home lab. But with that, let's move on to what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. So this is another pretty quick hit, brief one. Uh, but it was indeed, in fact, DNS after all. So I know it's kind of a meme at this point, where it's kind of like, have you tried turning it off and on again when something isn't working? The other potential common solution, especially if you're dealing with something networking related, is it being a DNS problem, which DNS, we've talked about it before, is basically the thing that allows you to type in URLs like apple.com, google.com, whatever, and it'll basically translate to the actual IP address on the internet where that website is located. So issues with DNS can cause all kinds of very, very annoying and stupid problems. And that is exactly what was happening with me this week that I finally figured out. So a few weeks ago, I touched on that I kind of fixed a lot of my infrastructure in the cloud because the Docker version was just so outdated. So I got that fixed and everything was mainly working fine. But I noticed I still wasn't getting push notifications from my Notify server that basically I have up for all my various monitoring for my home lab. So I have various things to basically check for, in my home lab. So if my internet goes down and I can't get out to the internet, basically I guess, an alarm, I guess you could say, a script running in the cloud that'll basically try to log into my home lab, reach out to the internet, and if it can't do that, my internet's down, so it'll send me an alert on my phone telling me as such. And then one of the more recent ones I did was setting up a monitor for my various ZFS pools, because I ran into an instance where an SSD died and I had absolutely no idea how long it was dead for, and that kind of spooked me because there would be the chance if another drive died that potentially could be, potential data loss with the RAID mirroring that I was doing. So I wanted to have a little more peace of mind in that, so I set up a Python script to basically monitor ZFS health of some of the servers I have, and then if something does go wrong, basically send me an alert through Notify. And then the other, I guess, main one that I've talked about is the IP address one. So if for whatever reason my home IP address changes, I have another alert that'll basically send me a push notification saying, "Hey, your IP address has changed. Here's the new one," so I can update my VPN's connections and things like that. So anyway, very, very useful. And then, of course, whenever I have push notifications also set up for when I run updates with my Ansible playbook to basically let me know when the updates are done. And then I also have ones for when I was doing my backup jobs as well, to kind of give me, I guess, iterative updates on, where I was in the process of running backup jobs. So definitely very useful, and the utility of that kind of goes down if you don't actually get the push notification and you have to manually go into the app and kind of refresh the feed to see if there's any new updates. So push notifications is definitely huge. But the main thing that ticked me off to that was I noticed that when I was running my Ansible playbook, sometimes I wouldn't get notifications. Well, actually, I was never getting notifications, but the thing of it was sometimes the playbook was a little hit or miss on if it would actually complete or not, since for whatever reason over the past like couple months I've been getting intermittent issues with Pi-hole trying to update. I don't know what it is, but sometimes the script will just hang and get stuck when trying to perform the update of my various Pi-hole servers. Still haven't really been able to track that down as to what the gremlin is that's causing this issue. So just because I run my Ansible playbook and like a half hour or an hour has passed and I haven't got a notification, doesn't necessarily always mean that it just completed and just didn't tell me, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But then one time I did, actually check, saw it completed, never got the push notification, went into the app and then refreshed it and saw it was sitting there. It just never, notified me. So I was doing some digging and trying to figure out what the heck was going on. And it turned out to be a DNS issue. So my Notify server is hosted in the same VPS that my VPN and Pi-hole are associated with. So on the VPS, I have a Pi-hole specifically for my VPN connection. So when I VPN into the VPS, I basically still get all the good Pi-hole goodies that I do at my house and through my home lab. So somehow, I guess Pi-hole was blocking the Notify ping, I guess. So basically how it works is if you self-host a Notify server, you have to, if you're on iOS specifically, you have to kind of send the push notification to Notify. So I guess somehow in there, Pi-hole was either blocking that or not resolving the domain, or something funky was happening with Pi-hole. So essentially what I did was just hard-coded the DNS config in the Docker Compose file. And then sure enough, once I did that, it immediately started working like it was supposed to. So it was, in fact, DNS after all. So I guess if you happen to have a Notify server and it's not sending you push notifications, DNS very well may be the culprit. If you still are getting the messages, just not getting the push notification for it, DNS very well might be the culprit. So that was some of the nerdy things that I got up to this week. And the last story we have to talk about is Microsoft. Now, I don't know what Microsoft was thinking or what they were up to. Now, I guess it should be noted that the story we're about to talk about wasn't specifically from Microsoft themselves, but from an executive that happens to work at Microsoft. So, to give a little bit of a background here, the big news out of Microsoft this week was they laid off over 9,000 employees. So, a lot of people lost their jobs over at Microsoft. But that wasn't the only kind of news that made headlines. So, in response to like the massive layoffs that happened, there was an Xbox executive that decided to step in and help those struggling with being laid off or potentially soon to be laid off with a LinkedIn post. Um, and he has since deleted that LinkedIn post, but because this is the internet, everything lives on in perpetuity. So it has been screenshotted, it has been quoted, it's all over the place. I will have a link down in the show notes that contains it if you're interested. So I'm not going to read the entire thing because if you've ever been on LinkedIn, some of those posts can get quite lengthy, and his was kind of sort of lengthy, although some of it was him like posting potential like prompts that you could give to an AI. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here. I guess I kind of spoiled a little bit. So like I said, I'm not going to read the entire post. If you want to read it, you're more than welcome to. But I did want to kind of pick out some of the more juicier tidbits from his post. So in the post, one of the things he said was, quote, "I've been experimenting with ways to use LLM AI tools like ChatGPT or Copilot to help reduce the emotional and cognitive load that comes with job loss." Um, yeah, so that's a little interesting. But he goes on later on in the post to say, quote, "No AI tool is a replacement for your voice or your lived experience, but at a time when mental energy is scarce, these tools can help you get unstuck faster, calmer, and with more clarity." Um, so basically what he's saying here is if you're feeling down and you're kind of mentally strained and stressed out about you losing your job or potentially using your job, console yourself with an AI tool, specifically an AI tool that Microsoft controls. So I think this could honestly be made into a pretty good advertisement. It's like uh, basically kind of going along the lines of, that's right. Are you in your feels? Are you depressed because you lost your Fang job? Well, don't worry, because at Microsoft, use one of our Microsoft owned chatbots to help you feel better. For the low, low price of all of your personal data, we'll help you feel better with unlicensed and possibly hallucinated advice on how to make yourself feel better and turn your life around. Order now. So that was kind of, I guess, the sales pitch that at least I kind of got out of this post. And apparently, I guess other people kind of had a very negative sentiment as well because the LinkedIn post, like I said, has since been deleted, but was screenshotted and posted on Blue Sky and kind of got raked over the coals by some folks, which, shocker, it generally doesn't go over well if you're basically telling people to pour out your emotions to an AI chatbot. Not, I don't think that should necessarily be a surprise to people that didn't necessarily get the biggest positive reaction. Um, but one of the prompts that he gave as like an example of something that you could ask one of these Microsoft owned and controlled AI assistants was, quote, "I'm struggling with imposter syndrome after being laid off. Can you help me reframe this experience in a way that reminds me of what I'm good at?" Now, I'm by no means trying to make light of people in these situations and experiencing these thoughts and feelings, because imposter syndrome is absolutely a real thing, and being laid off is very hard to deal with. And you definitely can kind of feel bad about yourself and like you might not be worth it if you got, laid off, from your job, for instance. So I definitely feel for those people. And I'm not trying to make light of their situation, but again, the thing of it is, if you're experiencing or struggling with negative feelings like this, then you should actually seek help from a licensed medical professional, your pastor, or some other human being with a soul, rather than a soulless chatbot that is just predicting the probability of the correct next word. Um, so, yeah, you probably. Now, granted, you and probably Microsoft's PR team are probably thinking and saying, well, I guess the normal person is probably thinking this, and Microsoft's PR team is probably actively spinning this, where they're basically saying this was just one guy and his individual review or individual views don't reflect that of Microsoft. Now, of course, that is a very corporate PR way to say anything of someone that works for them, giving remarks that has backlash. That is, of course, a very corporate PR thing to say. But it does technically hold true in this case because, again, this was just an individual that happened to work at Microsoft. Well, I guess technically they worked at Xbox, which is owned by Microsoft. But they were an executive there, so you would think that they would have at least a little more sway and kind of idea of kind of what the company wants potentially. But again, this was just an individual, and you could say doesn't reflect the larger views of Microsoft. Now, while this is true, Microsoft is similar to other companies like Google and Meta in the sense that, quite frankly, they don't give a dang about you. And as long as you keep using their service, feeding them your tasty, tasty data so they can profit off you, they could honestly care less what's going on with you. And they're more than happy as long as they keep making their money. Now, this is no more true than that case where Meta found themselves in, where they were accused of intentionally making their platform as addictive as possible, and basically all their platforms, to basically make them as addictive as possible to keep the users on them for as long as possible in order to harvest more of their data, sell them, feed them more ads, and all that good stuff. Even if the content that they were pushing had a negative side effect on the users' mental or emotional well being, as long as it kept them on the app. Facebook and Instagram and any of the Meta products did not care, because if they're on the app for longer, that means we get more data about them and we can sell that data for advertisers to show them more ads and make more money. Um, Similarly, Microsoft has a very vested interest in AI, basically like any big tech company out there these days. But Microsoft has really been putting their money where their mouth is over the past few years. The biggest evidence of this, obviously, is their big, massive partnership slash ownership of ChatGPT and OpenAI. Now, OpenAI is still technically a private company, but the amount of billions of dollars that Microsoft has put into OpenAI, I think it's safe to say they have a very controlling interest in what they do and how just ChatGPT runs in general. So the fact that they're pushing that, as in the guy's post, he literally called out two Microsoft products, which I don't think was accidental. I think that was very much intentional on his part. But you could also say the fact that they're trying to convince people to use their chatbots rather than seeking professional help is just a win for them, because that's more money for them, because people are turning to using their chatbots, giving them more data, and which they can then sell or use as additional training data. And that's just more money in their pocket. Whereas if they went to go seek help from a licensed medical professional, which they should, Microsoft doesn't get that money. Now, I understand that is a very cynical way to look at things, but we also have to take into account the track record here. And I think the track record probably kind of leads a little more down the cynical route than Microsoft is actually trying to want the best for people. But again, that's just, one man's opinion. But my honest take on all of this is that you should never be using an AI chatbot for emotional support or advice at all, just in general. It's just a good rule of thumb that anything related to like health and medical recommendations, you probably shouldn't be asking a chatbot that can make stuff up very confidently, because the last thing you want to do is take medical advice from an AI chatbot that completely just made something up and you end up harming yourself. That's really not a good idea. So anything in this space, you should absolutely be seeking professional medical help, and not that of an AI chatbot. However, if you are dead set on using an AI chatbot for whether it's emotional or mental support or whatever, which again I don't recommend you do, but if you are dead set in your ways and nothing I say will convince you otherwise, at least make sure that you're self hosting your own AI chatbot so none of this very sensitive and personal information about you gets harvested, used, and sold by some large tech company. But again, if you are seeking this kind of advice and support, again, you really should be, actually seeking a professional rather than consoling one of these chatbots. But yeah, so that was kind of I guess, the latest out of Microsoft this week. But to not end on such a depressing note, since a lot of these stories we've talked about have been quite negative, I wanted to end on a more positive note. Now, I probably should have put this in the nerdy things segment, but the reason I didn't was because it wasn't something that I actually did, because I didn't actually do anything. It was just kind of a thought that I had this week, and that was how you have a very mature home lab when you can go for a while without touching it and everything just works. Because I know personally, when I was first setting up my home lab, I was basically having to tinker with it on a, if not daily basis, like a very routine basis, to make sure everything was actually working like it was supposed to. But maybe you say that I am neglectful or negligent of my home lab, in which case you're not technically wrong. Just look at the nerdy things segments over the past few months, and you'll notice that I really haven't talked about it all that much because I really haven't done much of note with it. Now, sure, I still, run updates with it and stuff. I still run my Ansible playbook against it to make sure everything's up to date, because if I didn't do that, then that would absolutely be gross negligence, and I could probably be thrown in jail for that. But yeah, I really haven't had to touch it and really mess with it or do anything aside from just standard updates. And it's just been very, very rock solid. I haven't had really any issues with, Pi-hole doing something funky, or Bitwarden not working, or my VPN not allowing me to connect to it, or anything like that. It's just been very, very rock solid. Now, I guess maybe that's just a side effect of the fact that I haven't really been tinkering and messing with it that much, that it's been so rock solid, because again, sometimes if you try to tweak or mess with something, it ends up breaking said thing, which might have cascading effects to break other things. Now, I'm not saying that my home lab is a production environment by any means. um but like most home labs, it's kind of a collection of home lab and home prod, if you will, in the sense that you have like the things in your home lab that you kind of tinker with and kind of mess with and play with. But then you have the other things that are kind of more staples and services that you generally don't touch, because it kind of runs your internet and it runs your house and your life and everything like that. You really don't want to mess that up and then kind of be without it, because at least when I was, like in the early stages of my home lab, for instance, and really playing and tweaking with this stuff, sometimes I would mess something up and literally wouldn't be able to do anything else until I fixed that problem, because how big of an issue it was. So those kind of, you have to drop everything to kind of fix it, situations are generally things you don't want in the quote unquote prod side, of your home lab. And especially, if you have, like, if you're married or you have kids or a wife or something, and they kind of rely, on your home lab for like their internet. If you mess something up, and their internet connection goes down and they can't, stream or do their homework or access the internet or whatever, they're not going to be very happy with you and are going to be wondering what's going on. In which case, you have to fix it and make sure you get things back up and running. So that is kind of the joke between home lab versus home prod. Um, but yeah, so like a production environment though, the way you know your production environment is solid is when you really don't have to have much operator intervention to make sure things are working like they should be. Now, keep in mind this isn't a ignorance is bliss thing and everything is actually on fire and I'm just trying not to pay attention to it and ignore it, because I'm none the wiser. Because as we talked about, when I was talking in the nerdy things segment about some of the various push notifications I have set up, I do have things to alarm me and let me know if very core critical components of my home lab are not operating as they should be or experiencing some kind of, degraded, behavior or capability. So as such, it's not like I know I'm like I said, I'm not ignoring problems that exist because problems aren't existing, because if they would, or if they were, I would be getting, notifications like, hey, this ZFS pool on this server is in a degraded state because a drive is offline. It's like, ooh, that's kind of a big deal. Or hey, your home lab is inaccessible right now. Like, ooh, that's not very good. So things like this, I would get notified for, and it's honestly been very nice in that sense, right? That it's been so rock solid that I haven't had to tinker with it much, because I've been, quite busy the past few months and really haven't had a ton of time, to devote, as you've obviously seen, from the nerdy things segments the past couple months here. They've been very sparse at best most of the time, and that's mainly due to the fact that I haven't necessarily had a lot of time to kind of get into this stuff, because I've been just so busy with other things going on. But the fact that that my home lab isn't something that I've had to worry about has honestly been very nice and refreshing, because like I said, there have been instances in the past where something would go wrong in my home lab and I basically would have to drop everything that I was doing to fix whatever was going wrong in the home lab in order for me to go back to doing what I was doing prior to the home lab going down. So I kind of think of it as a massive win. And anyone that has ever had to deal with production environments and kind of managing them, like in, say, in the corporate world, you know that a rock solid production environment that you don't have to get paged for, is very, very nice to have. And it's one of those things that you don't, really truly understand the value of it until it's gone. It's one of those things that, like, I don't remember what the exact saying is, but like, you don't understand the true value of something until that thing is no longer with you. Or like, for instance, you don't know how good you have it until, you don't have it anymore, that kind of a thing. So yeah, so having a rock solid home lab right now has been absolutely fantastic. And the thing that's nice about it too is because everything is contained within the home lab, because like my pfSense router that kind of runs the infrastructure and the network between like my, I guess, standard user network versus like my home lab network, all that's like configured, through virtualization through Proxmox. So literally all I have to do to have my home lab fully up and functional is plug in my hypervisors, turn them on, turn my NAS on, and then make sure that I have an active internet connection feeding into my home lab, essentially feeding into my network switch. And if that's good and functional, my home lab is up and running, and I can literally move it around wherever I please because everything is contained and virtualized in that sense. So it's not like I really have to worry about reconfiguring everything because it's all already configured inside the home lab, which is so nice. Because that would honestly be a royal pain if I had to like manually reconfigure like all the IP addresses and everything like that. Now, obviously, I could easily write Ansible playbooks to do all that for me, so it would be very easy to do. It's just it would be kind of a pain that I'd have to run the playbook to. It's basically an extra step that I don't have to do, which is very nice. So yeah, having a rock solid home lab is definitely a very, very nice thing. Now, I know when it comes to home labs, the saying out there is when someone says like my home lab has reached its final form, that is a lie, and you shouldn't believe it because it's never finished. It always changes and evolves. You add new hardware, you deprecate old hardware, you create a new service, you remove a service you're not using anymore. It's always changing, it's always evolving, and I'm sure there will be more changes and more evolutions in the future. But at least for right now, it's kind of in a very good, solid state. And it's just been rock solid the past few months, which I cannot complain at all because it makes my life a lot easier. That I can actually have some free time and enjoy myself and don't have to worry about fixing something in my home lab. Which, don't get me wrong, is a very nice hobby and a good way to pass the time. But if you're trying to sit down and watch a movie from your Jellyfin server, and you can't connect to your Jellyfin server because some kind of issue's going on, well, now you have to troubleshoot that issue and fix it, and tinker around with your home lab when you might not necessarily have wanted to do that because you just wanted to sit down and watch a movie or a TV show or something like that. So having a rock solid home lab that I've been able to depend on and rely on without issue has been very, very nice. So hopefully adding this on a little bit more of a positive note compared to some of the other topics we touched on in this episode. But before we leave, let us get back to our trivia question for the week. So, this week's trivia question is: Unity is a commonly used cross platform game engine and was initially released in 2005 at a developer conference. What was the name of that developer conference? If you said the Worldwide Developers Conference, aka Apple's WWDC, congratulations, you got this week's trivia question correct. Which, if you're kind of mind blown by that fact, trust me, you're in good company because I was also mind blown by that fact. Now, maybe the kind of, I guess, I did kind of give half of the name away when I said developer conference because worldwide developer conference. So maybe that was your kind of guess. You heard developer conference and you're like, well, the only one I know of is Apple's, the WWDC. So I'm just going to go with that one. So if that was your guess, congratulations, you got it right. So props to you. And that's going to do it for me in this episode. So if you enjoyed it, definitely be sure to leave it a rating and review and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And if you have any questions about this week's episode, or if you have any topics or ideas for future episodes, you can leave a comment down below if you're on YouTube, or you can always email me at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. The link for that is down in the show notes below. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bool nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.